Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laszlo Jakab. I'm the director of Penn World Voices Festival. Penn World Voices Festival is happening as we speak now. It's a week-long international literary festival in New York City. It's been funded and created and conceived by Salman Rushdie, who is with us. Right, Salman? Yeah. Salman is here with us. It was 10 years ago when Salman had this idea to bring writers, journalists, philosophers from all over the world to discuss the most pressing issues of our lives. 10 years ago, no one thought that it's going to last this long. We have issues to talk still, and we have another 10 years, I guess, to bring people over here and discuss how we feel on the edge. On the edge is actually this year's festival theme. We have one more day in the festival. We have plenty of interesting programs tomorrow, so if you have the time, please visit us tomorrow at Cooper Union and around Cooper Union. So tonight we are doing something interesting. When I was putting together the program, I had this idea that I was actually trying to do something with Interview magazine, and when I was reading some of their major interviews, I had this idea that, God, how great it would be to go back in time and revisit these interviews and correct ourselves, take a revenge, and go back in time. So I talked to the people at Interview magazine, and miraculously they liked the idea, so I was really poised by them, and then we started to work together. We went into their archives. They have an amazing archive, as you may know, and we ended up with two names who we are proudly presenting today. So we're going to have Martin Amis and Michael Stipe, who are given this kind of like really amazing privilege to go back in time, immerse themselves into time, and take revenge and correct themselves. So what we're going to do, and this is the quite simple setting. The first part of the evening, we're going to have three people on stage. John Freeman going to conduct the interview, playing the old interview, reenacting the old interview with Anatol Yusef, an actor. And Martin Amis will be on stage with a notepad, and every once in a while, when John turns to Martin, he's going to be given the chance to correct himself. And then the exact same setting will going to be in the second part of the evening. I really want to thank the New School, our fantastic collaborative partner here, and personally Christopher Boland from Interview magazine, who is going to be introducing the second part of the show. So enjoy time. Thank you.
This is 1976, so you're going to have to insert some zipper boots on me. Did dead babies actually come from an experience you had?
It was based on a weekend I went through before I'd written my first book, where a lot of people were drunk, screwing, stoned, lying, and for about half an hour it seemed like hell. I thought there was a book there. Then it got stylized in my imagination, and 2 years later I wrote the novel. Throughout writing my first novel, I was thinking about it all the time. In fact, everyone agrees that part of writing is subconscious, and that does a lot of work for you. You can have terrible problems in a novel. You just don't know how you're going to get from A to B, and then don't think about it for a few months, and it's all ready, without your being aware of having attacked it.
Have you ever met anyone else whose father was a writer?
Auburn War, Evelyn Waugh's son.
Do you talk much about that between yourselves?
Well, we would both be embarrassed to talk about it. I always knew I was going to be a writer. That's what I always wanted to be. I think from the age of 12, I would start looking at life as possible novel fodder.
Tell me about your relationship with your father.
I've always had a terrific argumentative relationship with him. It's especially warm at the moment because I've just had a child. It's his first grandchild, and he says it's the best thing that's happened to him in a long time.
And in the past?
It's always been very good. He was the sort of father who kept in the background, is the euphemism. In fact, he was a rather indolent father who only took an interest in me when I became interesting. When I had read a few books and could talk to him about the things that preoccupied him. The best thing he ever did was not give me any literary encouragement. He still doesn't like my stuff. Can't finish most of my books. Doesn't like modern prose, basically.
I'm going to stop time here and turn to the real Martin Amis. One thing that struck me in rereading these 4 interviews with Interview Magazine was how much each of the first 3 asked you about your father as an influence. Did you have any sense of how much that would be part of the discussion when you began to publish books?
Well, having a writer-father started as one thing and then went on to being another. Funnily enough, it won me a lot of sympathy when I started in the early 70s. People said, oh, it must be so difficult coming out from under the shadow, etc. But that seems to me, that was the easy part. As long as you start young enough, when you're brave and stupid, you can get out from the influence of the father. What's fatal, and I've seen it with many sons of writers, is to say, I'll just think about it for a bit till I'm, in my late 20s. But by then it's too late, because layers of self-consciousness have come down on you, and fear of failure is acute. But then this all changed, and now I still think that it delegitimizes me in a weird way, having a writer-father, because in our egalitarian world, this revolution took place, revolution of thought took place in the 70s and 80s, anti-elitist. So, as I said, I'm sort of like Prince Charles. Someone began a piece about Prince Charles that just began with, I'm a massive fan of Prince Charles. And I thought it was a very funny opening line, because no one, who's not insane is a fan, slightest fan of Prince Charles. But he talks with this sort of ex cathedra authority based on nothing at all. I'm sorry, but I happen to believe this sort of thing. But with me, everyone sort of slightly suspects that I got where I am through, nepotism, taking over the family pub. And of course, it never is like that. But that feeling is very present now. And that's why people think they can, with the possible exception of Salman Rushdie, that they can say whatever the hell they like about you, because you're not quite legitimate.
And just one more follow-up question. In that first answer about the question about dead babies, you described the writing process as unconscious. That was 40 years ago. Throughout your work, there are misplaced father figures, there are fathers. At a certain point, do you, as a novelist, become aware of that? And when you're writing a new book, do you suddenly think, oh, here we go again?
Well, my respect for the subconscious has gone up and up as the longer I've been at it, the weirder the whole process seems to me to be. And Norman Mailer's very good book on the art of fiction, called The Spooky Art, is dead right, and he's very perceptive about this. When I was young and I'd come up against a difficulty, I would furiously attack the difficulty. And now I just walk away from my desk, and when it's fixed, I'll walk back. And it's writing is both more subconscious and more physical than people think. People think it's cerebral, that it's sort of front brain. It's not. It's your whole body is involved in some weird way. And you have to process things, not consciously. When you said just now that a couple of years later I was ready to write the novel, that's how long it takes. If you have an experience, significant experience, Norman Mailer said he wanted to start writing a novel about September the 11th on September the 12th. But he knew that was futile and impossible. And he said it'll take 2 or 3 years for this to sink into the writer's consciousness. And sure enough, very punctually, 2004, 3 or 4 or 5 novels came out on this subject. And that's That's a sort of psychological gestation, and I'm aware of that now, and I sort of play to it. Sometimes I think I could just lie on a hammock with a vodka and tonic and let my subconscious do the whole thing.
Now we'll go back to 1976. Has his style influenced you a great deal, or do you feel you've had to break free from it?
But my father's. You never think about these things till later. It's clear to me now, as one reviewer said of my first book, The Rachel Papers, that it would be an interesting way to get rid of an influence, to purge it, by imitation. I think I was very influenced by his. We both have this slightly mock heroic style where we describe low things in a high style. Certainly I enjoyed and used that lilt he had, particularly in my first books, and I'm still using it. Also, family humor is very hard to shake off. Your family humor determines your humor.
When did you have your child?
4.5 months ago.
As a writer, do you see the situation as possibilities?
There are going to be at least 3 babies in my next book. Actually, I think, and I'm sure every writer thinks this, that all major things in life really haven't been dealt with very much. I think you do feel with Tolstoy that such issues as death and birth have been tackled, but in most novels you read, you don't feel the momentousness of these things. There's no question that sexually it gives you a shot in the arm, or the eye. Life looks different, especially in my case at 35, halfway through, just when you can use it too. Do you have children?
Not yet. I'm not married yet.
Do.
Do? Well, I'm looking forward to it.
You'll wonder how you ever survived on the meagerness of life. Although, on the other hand, we came over on the airplane, the 3 of us, and you know, usually crossing the Atlantic is a treat. You can catch the movie and no one can ring you up or make you pay a gas bill, and you have that stolen time where it's just you. But now, it's all, is the baby all right? And go and get a nappy off the stewardess. Shortens the day, no question about that.
All right, let's stop time here. How old is this child now?
29.
Is he here?
Is he what?
Is he here in the audience?
No, he's not here.
Oh. I wonder, now that you live in the United States, is it odd to raise your children as Americans, or do they consider themselves Americans?
Well, 4 of my 5 children are half American anyway. And our young girls, who are now 14 and 17, have been practicing their American accents since they first went to camp. It's pathetic, really, to hear them trying out their American accents. But I think I spent some time in America when I was a child, and I feel sort of half American myself. My relationship with America and American history has changed in the 3 years I've been living here. Anti-Americanism in Europe is automatic almost everywhere. And in Latin America, where we spent some years as well. And I could never sympathize with that. I think, I love America. I feel that Christopher Hitchens used to say this, it's based on the only good revolution there's ever been. Revolution and independence, huge effort. But I must say I've been reading a lot of left-wing history about America, Howard Zinn, etc. And it does more and more seem to me that money has got into too many areas of American life, health, politics, etc. That it really is more like an oligarchy that has elections every 4 years. And the American administrations have always been quite candid about that everything, the courts, the law, is tailored towards what they call business, meaning corporations. And there's no other country on earth where someone would say, how about cutting taxes for the rich? It wouldn't occur to anyone. No one would ever say it. In America, it gets said, taken up, passed, ratified, and renewed. you know, in Europe, you'd look at it as if you were crazy if you said that. And it's turned out to be a disastrous policy, and we will not revoke those laws here in America. Once they're in, there they are. And a Republican would smirk his head off at the coup of getting tax cuts for the rich. And all the talk now about inequality is tremendously overdue. You know, not so long ago, there were gunfights between strikers and police. The inequities are really built in now and almost ossified.
If you were to write a novel like Money now, would it have to be a very different novel?
A novel called Money? Well, they say there are two kinds of title for novels. One is you finish the novel, then you call it something, as you would with a child almost. You sort of dream up a novel, write it, and then call it something. But there's the other kind of title that's sort of present all along, and where it's in the first page, it's in your mind, and it threads its way through the novel. But if I wrote a novel called Money now, I mean, God knows what direction it would go in. I called that one Money in 1984 because I was just sort of, to my alarm and surprise, realizing with these constant travels to America that how deep the money idea is in America. In a way, it isn't in England. And you know, Saul Bellow hammers on this theme. He said, it's the country of, if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich? When a Roman emperor put a tax on the sewers, people said, isn't that a bit, you know, vulgar? And he said, pecunia no nolet, money doesn't stink. And Saul Bellow said, these days money is the only thing that doesn't stink.
Let's go back to the late 70s. You've spent some time in the States growing up.
Yes, I lived for a year as a child in Princeton. And my mother lived in America for a long time. She had a fish and chip store in Michigan. So the American connection was always there. That was very valuable to me when I came to write about America. It usually doesn't work terribly well when writers cross the Atlantic. An American will think he's done enough if he has a taxi driver at Heathrow say, sorry mate, he seems a bit sleepy tonight, or something like that. An English writer will have an American character say, have a nice day, or you're welcome. Writing about another country is very difficult. You have to have confidence about it. And you can't get confidence without spending time there.
I would say to add to that if I had spent the year from age 9 to 10 in France, I would speak French. In Berlin, I would speak German. But I did it in America, and I sometimes believe that I can speak American. That when I come to do dialogue between Americans, or that I can sort of hear it just as I can hear English. And I wonder if that's an illusion, but I feel a bit more, much more confident about it because the rhythms have been in my head since the age of 9.
I want to ask you one follow-up to this. You describe how writing about another country is difficult, but later on after this, you would go and write Time Zero, which is not just writing another country, it's writing a colossal, catastrophic experience. What made you feel you were ready for that, to make that leap?
Well, that's about the Holocaust, this novel, Time Zero. And if you'd asked me a few years earlier who was the least likely British novelist to write about the Holocaust, I would have said me. Although it's something that has always bothered me, again from childhood. And I remember, I think my mother's to blame for this, because I've just written another novel about the Holocaust, just finished. And I once said to her, aged about 7 or 8, I said, Mum, what was all that about with Hitler and the rail tracks and the smokestacks. And she said, oh, don't worry about Hitler, she said. You've got blonde hair and blue eyes. Hitler would have loved you. And I felt quite relieved in a sort of ignoble way that I was on the right side of Hitler. But I think that sort of never ceased to bother me, really. And, so I felt I would have to take it on. The thing about doing it backwards in time, which is the sort of central conceit of that novel, is that the arrow of time is the arrow of morality. The morality of every situation, particularly every violent situation, changes diametrically when the arrow of time is reversed. To give a sort of clear, minor example, a child is crying its head off, you slap it around the face, and it starts to be happy again. Violence is always like that, as against the arrow of time. So I make the reader do the suffering, because the narrator is reporting these events as if a whole race has been dreamt out of the sky. Then they've been fattened up, and then they've been taken by train and put into their villages and allowed to have their life. The morality of it is completely inverted. And I don't think I could have, at that stage, come at it more directly than that. Although the novel I just finished is social realism of the same period.
All right, let's go back to the interviews of then. What is an average day in your London life?
I live with my girlfriend in Pimlico in a flat. 3 days a week I go to the office of the New Statesman about 10, do what needs to be done there and meet friends for lunch. Work through the afternoon and come home. Perhaps go out for a party or dinner or stay in and write. So, quietish, but with a fair amount of incidents. I'm talking to writers a lot, which is sometimes exciting. I'm throwing ideas around all the time, and that's good, and actually having, as far as I can see, a fucking marvelous time compared with everyone else. I'm aware 100 times a day what a horrible life everyone has compared with me, and although, of course, no one's perfect, but it's buzzing a bit in London. And actually, I find it quite stimulating the way everyone is re-examining life from the point of view of not making enough money, and the mild danger you live through every day. It's not a bad decade to be in London.
The Information, if you haven't read it, is a fabulous novel that will tell you the terrors and hatreds that being a writer might provoke. But I think one thing that gets lost in that book, because it's so much about envy, is that a great deal of your life has been about literary friendships. You've had long literary friendships, good close friendships with Salman Rushdie and Christopher Hitchens. Can you talk a bit about those and how they sustained you in any way?
Well, writers don't spend much time talking about writing, each other's writing. You know, you say, have you read so-and-so, and then you have a session on that. But you don't talk about your current struggle with a work of fiction. It's too private and too raw. When it's done, when it's out, you're happy enough to talk about it. But it's just a bit too intimate and sort of icky in some weird way.
You're still English. I love this.
But it's very different with a novelist. With Christopher Hitchens, he is, discursive writer, the discursive writer, not imaginative. And Ian McEwan and I often used to wonder why he didn't turn his hand to fiction, because he had the rhythm, he had the ear, he was a great mimic, he had the equipment, he had the sort of social antennae for it. But he never did. And Ian said it's just because he doesn't have the temperament to sit around all day making things up, which, alas, is what fiction amounts to. But I've just been rereading his last book, Mortality, And I suddenly realized that if you put it into the third person and the past tense, it not only reads like a novel, but it reads like a novel, you know, slap bang in the middle of the English serio-comic tradition. You know, the first sentence would be rewritten like this, would go, he had often woken up feeling like death. And suddenly, you know, it could be Angus Wilson or any number of English comic novelists, and nasty inventiveness. He's getting some bad advice that he knows all about already. He's seeing various experts. And he said, all I got out of that was a bug bite that briefly doubled the size of my right hand. You know, that's just the sort of novelistic invention. But alas, everything in that book is gospel truth.
You came of age with Salman and Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro, and there was an enormously talented generation, 5 or 6 or 8 of you, all around the same age. What was in the drinking water in Britain at this time? Was there something that you were responding to that made your generation necessary? Or
well, you know, as you get older, you get very interested in the social history of what you've lived through, and the geo-history too. You know, for my father, it was the war. That was the central experience, and the changes that the war brought about. But for a more fortunate generation, such as we all were, Ian, Julian Barnes, etc., Salman, I think it was the great energizing thing was the sexual revolution. All these new possibilities and opportunities. And Philip Larkin wrote famously, sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Band and the Beatles' first LP. That's very famous. The next stanza is really revealing. It goes on, up till then there'd only been a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. And I remember that ethos too, just as in the late 60s as it was dawning, this new, the rise of women is the shorthand for it, and it did take that form. And an incalculable benefit to humanity. In Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I think is on the way to causing a little revolution in consciousness, he gives, you know, violence has declined. It's counterintuitive, but he proves it as much as something like that can be proved. The main thing, of course, is the emergence of the state, Leviathan, and it's the monopoly of violence that it insists on. This is one of the other odd things about America, is that they've never accepted that the state has the monopoly of violence. No, we want some violence. And the idea that it's just there to, you know, the militia's mentality is just there in case the government gets a bit too tyrannical. If America did have a fascist government, would a lot of good old boys with shotguns be any match for the American army? But that's one major reason why violence has declined. The other is the invention of printing, and rather flatteringly, the emergence of the novel, because it teaches us, it has taught us to imagine we're someone else. Pinker doesn't like the word empathy. He said he was cycling through Boston and he heard a mother screaming at her children, "Show some empathy." But that's what it is. And the other reason he gives is the rise of women. And this isn't just, you know, murders and robberies. This is violence to children, violence to gays, violence to animals. It's all come down. It's all decreased. And so the rise of women was, that's what energized us. And in Ian McEwan's case, he said that was in a sort of manifesto, he said, this is what the novel is now about.
Let's go back to the interview. Do you think it would throw off your rhythm to move to New York for a year and write?
Yes, it might do. I'm very conscious, in spite of the subject matter in my book, of working in a tradition. And the British is a more sedentary tradition than you have in New York, where I keep getting electric shocks.
Brief interlude here. You have now moved to New York. Do you still feel these electric shocks, or you live in a more pastoral part of the city?
No, the electric shocks is a very fogey-ish objection to America, and I haven't noticed them for many years, but it's... I tell you what struck me when we came to live here, and I've been hundreds of times to America, of course, but when we actually came to live here with our furniture sort of on the way following us, I was struck for the first time, as if I'd never even thought about it, by the weight of America, the size of America, the mass of America. And it actually terrified me to think I was part of such a continental-sized operation. America, the first and most necessary thing to take on board when you think about America is Henry James's remark, America's more like a world than a country. It's endlessly true with that. And that Mississippi and Massachusetts don't have that much in common. And it is like, it's like going through Europe. The differences are as extreme. One moment you're in Bulgaria, and then you're in Portugal, then you're in Paris, etc.
To go back to the interview now, we're leaping forward to 1985 with a very 1985 question. Do you find yourself very caught up in the money world?
I can boast that I hardly give it any thought.
You don't follow the markets?
Oh, Christ, no. Jesus, that makes me sort of pant with exhaustion. To open any letter from an accountant costs me more effort than to write a short story. I haven't opened a bank statement for years because I worked out very early on that the thing about bank statements is that you don't have to do anything about them. They arrive. You can look at them if you like, but you don't have to write back. So I stopped opening them. I have the supreme luxury now of not having to worry about it because I don't spend a lot. I'm not interested in spending it.
So you've never been tempted to go out and buy that Rolls Royce?
I do have sort of vulgar fantasies of me driving around in a big car and people looking enviously at me, but I have an accountant and a secretary who comes in every now and again, and otherwise I don't want to know. I just don't want to know. I really hate it. I'd probably get much more interested in it if I didn't have any. But I've got enough. I can't understand why people aren't more satisfied with having enough. It's the least attractive of human flaws, this wanting more than enough, which strikes deep into all sorts of competitive urges. Of course, one's definition of enough goes up all the time, and so does mine. I mean, I've got a lot of respect for money, and don't want to get beaten up by it. I won't insult it if I'm standing next to it at the bar. On the other hand, I'm not interested in it for itself.
The way that John Self and money has become Americanized, his obsession with junk food, with cars, with money, is that in any way meant as a cautionary tale for your English readers to watch out for the American influence?
I would certainly say America is a lot further down the money road, probably because of the absence of a class system. Though there is a sort of fossilized class system. It's not the engraved, absolutely saturated class system that we have in England, which is still an incredibly powerful agent in everyday life. So what comes in to replace that anxiety but money? It sort of fills up the gap here.
And it's measurable, too, unlike class.
Well, I want to jump in here because I think about Lionel Asbo and how England has changed so much in the last 10 to 15 years. London especially has become a financial capital. There's huge pools of wealth being made there now, and England's property market is being treated like a currency exchange by Norway and the Gulf states. Is there although the class system is very much there, is this sort of culture of money entering England in a way that it wasn't when you were doing this interview?
Well, the class system was tremendously powerful. It seems ridiculous now, but in a dozen interactions every day, you would feel resentment from below and condescension from above. The person who destroyed the class system, more or less, was Margaret Thatcher, by hiring all those people called Keith and Norman and Cecil. But she detached the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, from the upper classes. And it was always my central objection to monarchy was that the monarchy was worth a couple of million votes to the Conservatives at every election, just out of instinctive, reflexive conservatism and respect for your betters, your so-called betters. When I was a real expert on class when I was in my mid-teens, and I did a quiz once in the Daily Mail, very class-conscious paper, saying, how posh are you? And I rolled up my sleeves thinking I was going to come up very posh. Do you call it toilet, lavatory, WC? Lavatory. Is it couch, sofa, or settee? Sofa. I knew it all. And I came to the last question. I was wondering what an astronomical score I'd built up. It said, if you had a son, what would you call him? Montague, Sebastian, or Villiers? And I thought, nah, that's bullshit. David, Henry, George, and I thought that's the one. And then C, Keith, Kevin, Martin. And the pen tinkled from my hand, and I thought, there's no way out of this one. But with the receding of the class system, then absolutely the money incentive grows, because that's your legitimacy now. You don't need 5 generations that haven't gone near trade. Class was very nice for a long time for the people whose ancestors gypped and extorted the money from the helpless and the poor. As long as you did it long enough ago, it was fine. But that has been exposed for what it is now.
We're jumping ahead now to 1990. There's a tendency in your writing toward imagining the worst. You wrote a series of stories a few years ago, Einstein's Monsters, that had to do with the nuclear holocaust. And now there's London Fields, which has a millennial crisis going on throughout. Have apocalyptic themes always preoccupied you?
I don't know. You don't really map out your themes. Those are the things you realize when you've finished a book. When you start, you've just got situations and characters. It's quite odd, come to think of it, and in most of my recent books, death is my subject. Other People is about a girl who's dead when the book begins. Money is a suicide note, and London Fields has a dying narrator. But in my life, it's only in the last few months that I've really understood anything about death. So all those novels are really just shots in the dark.
What's happened in the last few months to change you?
Well, turning 40 is a big event. But it didn't come on the stroke of midnight of that particular day. No, it's just biological. There's a biological delay before you begin to understand that actually you're going to die. You're in your early 30s?
I would sort of elaborate on that in that I'd say 45 now. Pushed it back a few years. But I'll tell you, you can define the moment where your youth dies. And it's up until then, every time you look in the mirror, you think I accept intellectually that I'm going to grow old and die. But it happens to everyone except you. And you say, I don't know how you did it, but lucky you, clever you. It's not going to happen in your case. Then it becomes a real full-time job looking the other way, And when that moment comes, that's the end of your youth. And then, as I found since then, you think life is going to get thinner and thinner. You say to yourself all the time, that went a bit quick, didn't it? You know? Often with swear words in between those. Right? And then something weird happens when you turn 50, in that it's as if there's a palace that's been attached to your house. An endless palace. It's a Borgesian infinite palace. And all that is the past. That once the past gets bigger than the future, then it fills you. And it's a great resource. Then, of course, you turn 60, and all I thought then was, this can't turn out well.
Are there any American writers that you like?
On top of the ones I've liked all along. Don DeLillo I like. I'm not 100% clear what I think about him. And Elmore Leonard.
He's a good read.
He's more than that. He's heading up toward Chandler class. He just never hits a false quality. On page after page, everything is just right. It's true that he works on this relatively narrow canvas, but he's good. Robert Stone, I like too, but you see, these are all guys who are over 50. I don't read my contemporaries much. It's too much like potluck. I like to read the great settled corpora of work. I read a few of the Brat Pack. I read a few of the Brat Pack, and well...
Bellow and Mailer seem to have been important to you. But the looming presence in your work still seems to be Nabokov.
Do you think? Still?
Yes, and not just in your sense of prose rhythm or language, but in your love of literary gamesmanship. The writer as character often seems to be intruding.
Yes, but that particular slot is almost as old as the novel. Lawrence Stern does it, in my view, to a sickening degree. Gamesmanship is a postmodernist label, but really it's always been there. There's always been this stream throughout the novel, this insistence on explaining what the writer is up to.
Will you encourage your sons to be writers? You know, Amos Field and Amos Pettyfield?
My father never encouraged me, and I would never encourage them. I would never discourage.
It's a very complicated thing to encourage your child to follow your profession, particularly when it's what Saul Bellow calls one of the delirious professions. And a very, very famous writer came into my office in the New Statesman, where we publish poetry, as well as book reviews, etc. And he said, my son is an absolute genius poet. And the son was 15 or 16. And I thought, hang on, there's never been a genius poet of 16, maybe Rambo. But there are no prodigies in literature. Only in chess, music, and maths, which what they have in common, those three things, is that they have nothing to do with life. They're autonomous areas that don't need life they don't have to feed off life in the way that fiction and poetry does. So I took these poems and I looked at them, and 16-year-old poetry, and I wrote him a letter saying, the boy, saying, please go on sending me your stuff, and there's certainly some promise here, and encouraging that. Then a year or two went by, and the next poem I got from him began, my dad is a fucking bastard. You think? And what the father had done was say, you can have my life. And no, you can't have your father's life, your mother's life. There are very few cases in any literature, in any language, of two generations of writer. It's much more common in music and in painting. But it's lightning striking twice in the case of fiction and poetry, I think.
And it might be three in your case. You have a...
yeah, but then maybe we'll all get away with it, because it'll be such an anomaly. But I think, the resentment I talked about for those who seem to inherit what they have is you become a genetic elitist, and that is not going to get weaker. That is going to get stronger. The democratizing of everything is the most immovable force in modern life.
Well, we're going to go back for one last quote from the interview and leave it at that. But we couldn't have all serious conversation. So why have you been less interested in writing about drugs than about drink? Does it have to do with how you grew up? Your father hasn't exactly avoided booze as a subject.
Yes, he's a serious drinker. Drink, like sex, tells us an extra thing about someone. It strikes me more and more that we don't really know much about each other, even people we know well. We keep so much hidden. We put the 10% on display, the rest is all secret. And when people are drunk, you find out another 10%. And when you discover what someone is like sexually, you discover another 10%, or maybe more.
I don't know if drugs give another 10%. Sometimes I think drugs remove.
Or obscure, the original 10%. In my early novels, people smoke dope and stuff, but alcohol is something everyone has an attitude towards, especially in New York, where it seems that everyone has stopped drinking.
Smoking, too.
You're more efficient when you don't drink. But also, you can keep that other 10%. Someone from New York said to me not long ago, "You produce an awful lot. Are you a workaholic?" I said, "No, I'm an alcoholic." I'm a much more old-fashioned person. In fact, I'm not an alcoholic, but drink is present every day of my life in those few glasses of wine at the end of the day. When people say that, I often think it means a few bottles. Funnily enough, a mild hangover is often a good starting point to write. I think the reason writers do drink a lot, almost without exception, American novelists, if they're not Jewish or alcoholics, is that writers have time to recover. You haven't got to get up the next morning. And perhaps, more than most people, you do want an escape from yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Amis.